we're going to have my dear friend and colleague and collaborator, Adam Frank. He's going to talk about Beyond the Blind Spot, Science, Culture, and a New Way Forward. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Adam. He is an astrophysicist, a stellar astrophysicist indeed. He studies the final stages of evolution of stars like the sun. So he likes to study things that go boom. And because they explode, they also process a lot of the heavy chemical elements that you and I and all of everything that exists is made of. So his computational research group at Rochester has developed advanced supercomputer tools for studying how stars form and how planets evolve. He's also very interested in life in the universe, so astrobiology, or also what we call astrobiology of the Anthropocene. You know, he's an evangelist of science. He's committed to showing others the beauty and power of science. He's written 4 books. The latest one is Light of the Stars, Alien Worlds, and the Fate of the World. Actually, 3 books, and The Fate of the Earth. He has written 2 other books, The Constant Fire, Beyond the Religion and Science Debate, and About Time, Cosmology and Culture at the Twilight of the Big Bang. So you can see that Adam is one person that embodies the spirit of the Institute, which is to bring together scientific and humanistic concerns so that we can move forward as a better species in a planet that can give us a chance to survive if we're smart enough. He's the co-founder with me, actually, of the blog 13.8 on Big Think, after we've had it for 7 years at NPR and then 2 more years at Orbiter. So we've been doing this for quite a while now, about 12 years. He is an on-air commentator for NPR, All Things Considered, and he's a contributor to the New York Times, NBC, Washington Post, and many other places. He also serves as a science consultant, being the coolest guy, obviously, of Marvel's Doctor Strange. So there you go. His work in public outreach was recently honored with the American Physical Society's 2020 Joseph A. Burton Forum Award. So that's extremely important. And his latest book has been considered by NPR a valuable perspective on the most important problem of our time, i.e. our survival. And he was awarded for that book the 2019 Phi Beta Kappa Award for Science. So I'm very, very happy to welcome my friend and collaborator, Adam, to talk about the blind spot. Hi, Adam.
Hey.
Okay, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. So I guess the one thing is I'd like to switch over. Can you see my talk, the PowerPoint? Yes, there you go. Okay, so I'm going to close that. So now hopefully now you only see the PowerPoint. So let me begin here. So first of all, thank you. It is such a pleasure to be part of this, and I just want to honor everything that happened with the Institute that you guys did with it, because I was lucky enough to be a fellow and just be part of a number of events that you did, and I've learned so much. And really, this was really exemplary about trying to bridge the gap between the different ways of knowing. So along those lines, this project actually came out of my time at ICE. And the title here is Beyond the Blind Spot, Science, Culture, and a Path Forward. And this is work that myself and Marcelo and also the philosopher Evan Thompson are doing. And it started off, there we go, as an article for Aeon magazine, as we were sort of trying to put together a different way of thinking about science and culture. And now it's about to be a book. We're finishing up this summer a book, which really has been so much fun digging into. And the place to start on this is thinking about, what some people have called the long emergency and our project of civilization. And by civilization, I'm thinking about sort of what has come after the agrarian revolution, essentially, and the different transformations for good or ill that came from that. So the 21st century seems to have a lot of crises going on all at once. There is the environmental crisis, climate change, and resource depletion, as we just so eloquently heard about in what's happening in the West and water. There are social and technological crises associated with artificial intelligence, as also we heard so eloquently earlier about the misuse of the artificial part of this artificial intelligence. And then obviously income inequality. And then there's the institutional. We have the decline of democratic norms across the world, but most recently here and ongoing in the United States. And my argument here, or our argument, is that the long emergency, part of it is a crisis of meaning whose source, particularly for the truly existential threats, where really it's the project of civilization that's kind of up for grabs. A lot of this source comes from a worldview, a paradigm, if you want, that is built from, but not identical to science. So this is something associated with science. And so this is one of the biggest points, is this worldview is often claims to speak for science, but actually it's really an add-on. And what is required now is for us to re-envision science and its role in human culture. And that's what this project is about. And in this many ways, what we're talking about here is the Enlightenment and its legacy. So, we, meaning those of us in the West, but also, obviously it's spread globally, inherit a vision of what is a good society from the Enlightenment. And key parts of this are an emphasis on science and reason. And certainly some of that inheritance was deeply worthwhile, right? Science as a means to public truth, a way to actually establish truths that we could all agree upon, a method. An emphasis on universal human rights. That was a great idea. But along with that, there's also parts of that legacy that were blindness and brutalism, and certainly didn't live up to the ideals that some in the Enlightenment were proposing. Much of the culture that came from it was inherently racist and sexist, building these hierarchies that allowed a privileged group to dominate. Part of that was economic exploitation in the form of colonialism and slavery. And then along with those lines, there was also a sort of, a vision of the world, really, where all life, the individual organisms, ecosystems were just seen as a machine. It's just a machine that can be, used for whatever means, and never recognize the natural world as its own thing, as its own inherent value. And along with this, part of this was sort of these, what I will call reductionist logics of production. Part of the theme running through this is that this worldview that is associated with science, because of its power, spread through the rest of the culture we were building. And, the reason we have climate change, the reason we haven't done anything about climate change, was in part because of the way that worldview infected our political economy. So the idea here is that, science, during the Enlightenment, before the Enlightenment, during the age of science rose to become a power. It became a power as a method. It became a power as an institution or institutions. And it became a power as a means to generate economies. It was to increase productions. With the rise of science and its power, its cultural power, there was also a metaphysics or a worldview that arose that claimed to speak for it. And that worldview came to dominate the narratives of the culture when it came to thinking about the universe, when it came to thinking about life, the nature of self, and the nature of society. And what Marcelo and Evan and I are doing is we call this view, this worldview, associated with science, but not science itself, the blind spot. And much of this talk is to sort of unpack what this blind spot was, identify the problems it caused, and at least point to ways in which now is the time we need to go beyond it to deal with the various crises. So this metaphor, what do we mean by the metaphor of the blind spot? Well, what we mean is at the heart of science lies something which we do not see, which makes science possible. This is just like the optic nerve. And that thing that we cannot see, or that is difficult for science to see, is direct experience, right? And direct experience is a weird thing to talk about because, clearly you're going to be like, well, what do you mean direct experience? But that's really the problem. It is so close to us that it is often the most difficult thing to see. So direct experience, there's other words for it, lived experience. Presence is a good word. The sheer presence. Every morning you wake up and there you are, right? And it doesn't go away until you die and then whatever. Another word is being, the verb to be. And then finally, the life world. It's the totality of embodied lived experience. And so we want to show in this talk, I want to show how that it's been difficult for science to see this and deal with it, or particularly the blind spot view of what science does to see this. And it's caused enormous damages, both within science, we would argue, and then also because of the way science affects culture. So where did the blind spot come from as a philosophy or a metaphysics? I think it's very much tied to the fact that science grew out of the Abrahamic and Greek philosophical traditions, particularly as we're going to see that much of a key aspect of the blind spot is the idea that science gives us access to a privileged, objective view of the universe that is absolutely independent of anything human. And this certainly makes sense within the Abrahamic tradition because that's what God was. God was the perfect viewer, the objective frame from which to view the world. And if science had originated, or the form of science we had originated perhaps from the classical India or Asian cultures, that might not have occurred because those were not fundamentally monotheistic cultures. But the real origin of the blind spot is the triumph of classical physics in the 16, 17, and 1800s. I like to call this the empire of dynamical equations, because what happened with classical physics is through people like Newton and Lagrange and Hamilton, we found an exquisite way of describing matter and motion. We had these equations, these powerful abstract equations that could describe matter and motion with such acuity that we were able, one problem after another toppled, from how to build a bridge to how to describe the motions of the planets. And the thing to understand about the classical physics is it was from Newton's equations onward, it was a rise of abstraction. The dynamical equations, meaning the equations we had for describing particles and their motions, became ever more abstract, from Newton's equations then to Lagrange's equations in the late 1700s, early 1800s, and then Hamilton's equations in the middle of the 1800s. This system became ever more abstract, highly mathematical, beautiful to comprehend. I mean, just the sheer eloquence of it mathematically was a triumph. It was an absolute triumph of science. And it was sort of based on viewing that considering it, that this metaphysics that would come to dominate much of science, whether you were thinking about species or economics even, came to hold. And it's important to understand that this view looked at the world, any system, as having a state, which for classical physics would be the position of a particle and its momentum. And it's going to be important when we talk to quantum mechanics. And these dynamical equations allowed you to then predict the state into the infinite future. As long as you had a powerful enough computer, if you knew the initial state of the system, you could predict it forever. Okay, so that's where it rose out of. What were the characteristics? What are the characteristics of this constellation of ideas that we're going to call the blind spot? Well, there's a few that we want to go through. Experience is an epiphenomena, hard or strong reductionism, an emphasis on objective ontologies, an emphasis on materialism or physicalism, and the reification of mathematical laws. Let me go through each one. So this is really the core here, is experience is an epiphenomena. So the idea from the blind spot is that there's really nothing unique or special about our experience. It's nothing but neural computations in the brain. So the brain is just a meat computer, and all that's happening is there's signals coming in and they're processed, and that's really all experience is. The sense of presence or of being that is so rooted, is so essential to being connected to the world. It's just an epiphenomena of those computations. And so there's nothing in and of itself going on with experience that's any more than the sum of these computations. So that's a real critical part of what we call the blind spot. But along with this is what we would call hard or strong reductionism. And that is all truths, anything that's truly true has to be reduced down to the truths about fundamental entities like subatomic particles and their relationships, which are forces. So this gets codified in this sort of joke physicists like to tell. Sociologists defer to psychologists, psychologists defer to neurologists, chemists defer to physicists, physicists defer to mathematicians, and mathematicians only defer to God. So I'm sure mathematicians like this too. But really what this is saying is that there are no fundamental truths that can come from art or music or dance or poetry or spiritual endeavor, because those can't be fundamental. They just all ultimately reduce to, well, first your neurons, the meat computer in your head, and then the neurons just reduce to what's happening with atoms. And of course, this is a dead world, right? This is a world that would not be able to recognize life itself. What are those basal structures or those fundamental entities? They're the subatomic particles, either the ones we know about in the standard models or the ones we might hypothesize for a theory of everything, where we were able to embrace both gravity and matter in what would be called quantum gravity. And these particles are moving around in a space-time, which also needs to be included as fundamental. Okay, another part of this is what we could call objective ontologies. The idea of the blind spot is that science is going to give you perfect access to a perfectly objective reality that is independent of anything human. Science offers a circumspective God's eye view. This is why I kind of see it connecting to the Abrahamic tradition of this independent reality. And anything, the objects, quote unquote, that are found in science are real in and of themselves, and they have essential properties that are also independent of any interaction or observation. So the point then of science is to give us the furniture in God's living room. And, if you don't believe me about this, check out the title of this book. I love this book. I think Marcelo has an article in here. I just love the title, right? Science and Ultimate Reality. You always have to use the echo box when you use that. But you can see, right? This is the reason I bought this book, was I was like, wow, I'm going to study science. I'm going to learn about ultimate reality. And it's this idea that science gives you an access to ultimate reality, as opposed to, the ultimate reality may be experience itself. You started with ultimate reality. But, the idea is that from the blind spot view is that the reality we experience is actually some kind of illusion. And the true ultimate reality comes from the reduction to those fundamental entities exist. And science gives us perfect access to it. Then comes materialism and physicalism, which is the idea that all that exists, all that is real, is composed of matter and fields described by physics, and one can, in principle, make a list of everything physical in the universe, and that will exhaust reality. Now, I want to emphasize that for Marcelo and Evan and I, it's not that we're going to take the opposite of materialism and physicalism, which would be idealism that says, oh, there's only mind out there. What we're really actually going to point to is the fact that this whole split between the physical and the mental and having to choose between them is in fact already a consequence of the blind spot, of mistakes the blind spot made in the way it encountered the world, and the fact that it devalued experience the way that it did, as we shall see. And then finally, the reification of mathematical laws, that mathematical physics, in some sense, for the blind spot, constitutes a kind of skeleton on which the flesh of the world or reality, the flesh of reality, is hung. And what this really means, it's very much Plato's doctrine of ideal forms, that mathematical relationships express a higher or more ideal reality. So here's the little image of the parable of the cave, the prisoner's dilemma, and the problem here, well, actually, you can see this, as I was talking about, from classical physics. This came from seeing these incredible abstractions like the Hamiltonian formulation of classical mechanics be so useful, be so efficacious that, of course, if you were, inclined towards Greek philosophy, you would see in Plato's philosophy that, yes, there were actually these mathematical forms that were more real than actually what we experience. That comes through experience. So what I want to point to now, having gone through sort of the characteristics of the blind spot worldview, is to point out that is what has happened, over the last 100 years. Really, is that what we've seen is a kind of a crisis of meaning arise, because science, especially from a blind spot view, appears to make human life insignificant. The narratives of cosmology and evolution tell us we're just a tiny contingent accident in a vast and indifferent universe. But now, over the last 100 years or so, science also demonstrates that we really are going to have a hard time if we try to step outside our human situation to get a God's eye view of reality. And we're going to see that now as we look at places like quantum mechanics, cosmology, cognitive science, that actually you end up with a bunch of paradoxes that you have to do some kind of mental gymnastics if you follow the blind spot logic down when you confront some of the results of science now. So let's look at a few of these. So first we can deal with cosmology. So, one of the great efforts of a kind of blind spot view of science is to find the theory of everything, the theory that will give you the fundamental actors and the fundamental relationships between those actors, and that is it. From there on in you'll have a set of equations and the book is closed. You will have described everything out there. And so that has been a hope for a long time, and it has been thwarted time and time again. And so ideas like supersymmetry that people were very hopeful for, with good reason, absolutely did not play out. And here is this Scientific American article called "A Crisis in Physics," because this path towards a theory of everything really has been blunted. And then, of course, quantum gravity, which is the ultimate theory of everything, we still are deeply, deeply blunted in that, even though there's been decades upon decades of work on this. And for some of these efforts, some of the things that were most popular and gained the most popular attention in a very blind spotty way, actually were full of fictions, things that had to be called fictions. For example, string theory, which there was, countless books and other multimedia done around, depended for its work on extra dimensions, which were unseen. They had to posit the fact that there were this whole levels of reality that were unobservable or potentially unobservable for it to work. For inflationary cosmology, at least the current version we have, is plagued by the idea of a multiverse, that there are, in order for this to work, you have to have a infinite number of other universes that are also potentially unobservable, which is a weird thing. If you want to say, look, I want to explain this universe, but the only way I can do it is to posit an infinite number of unobservable universes, as people rightly question, is this even science anymore? And this is this paper here, The Scientific Method, Defend the Integrity of Physics by George Ellis and Joe Silk, that was really pushing back on these. The view of cosmology that you could somehow describe it, you could free cosmology from any questions about the observer, in a dream of at least getting this theory, this perfectly objective theory of everything, certainly has run into both difficulties and some knots that perhaps could be untied if we began to reconsider our starting point. What I'm saying here is that the metaphysical foundations of some of these approaches have sort of run out of steam. Now, of course, there's quantum mechanics, right? There's no way to talk about this without talking about quantum mechanics. I pointed out that classical physics, classical mechanics, was where the blind spot was born. And one might argue that quantum mechanics was where it died, because we've had quantum mechanics for 100 years now. And after 100 years, we know exactly how to apply the calculus of quantum mechanics to make quantum toasters or computers, but we still don't know what it means. And there's many weirdnesses associated with quantum mechanics, but the biggest one is the measurement problem. So remember, I talked about the classical state in physics. The classical physics state was a position momentum. In quantum mechanics, you don't get that. You get something called the wave function, or phi. And there's also a dynamical equation that holds, and I've written it here, it's Schrodinger's equation. But unlike classical physics, this equation, which totally describes how the state function describing your physical system behaves, it totally works until a measurement is made. And then the equation, it gets a pink slip, it's fired, and then the measurement process itself, in some way that people really don't understand, produces the answer, or yields, one answer out of the 50 or so answers that the dynamical equation was giving you. And this doesn't happen anywhere else. So this whole idea of reifying the math, well, these mathematical equations are supposed to exist in and of themselves. And yet here we have this place where this beautiful, perfect equation just suddenly arbitrarily stops working because a measurement was made. So, that sort of, and it's ironic, of all the places that quantum mechanics would really, really screw up relative to classical physics, it would be a measurement. It would be a place where, at least seemingly, the measurer steps in. But of course, it's not clear what a measurement is. And we now end up with these quantum interpretation wars. So we don't know what quantum mechanics means. We don't know how to interpret it. So we now end up with 100 years of different interpretations, some of which are trying to, sort of fit back into the blind spot metaphysics. And some are willing to venture out of it. So there's what are called ontological versus epistemological interpretations. And I list some here. We've got leading with the ontological interpretations lead with the many worlds. The epistemological interpretations lead with the Copenhagen interpretation, or the one I like a bit that I spelled wrong here was quantum Bayesianism or cubism, and then Carlo Rovelli's relational interpretation sits in the middle here. And the thing is, what we have to understand is all of these, even the people who want the blind spot kind of view to be restored, nobody gets away for free. There is always a price to be paid in quantum mechanics. You're never going to get that perfect classical world back. That's why I have this little Ghostbusters sign here. So, for example, the many worlds interpretation, which wants to have this beautiful, objective view of the universe. Yeah, well, what you end up with there is every time a measurement is made, the universe splits off into parallel copies of itself. So in that view, there's like an infinite number of, again, unobservable parallel universes. That's the price you pay for not wanting to perhaps take an epistemological view of quantum mechanics. But of course, the epistemological views have their own questions. So what my point here is that there is always a price to be paid. So that is the crisis. The blind spot science has a crisis when it comes to quantum mechanics. Now, cognitive science is another place we end up with crises. And the problem here is within cognitive science, one of the dominant ways of thinking about it is the computational model, that basically, again, meat computer, your brain is just a big meat computer and it's computing signals. And that's what cognition and knowing are all about. But the problem with this is that the problem is meaning. Meaning, semantics lies over and above computation. So computation is only cognitively effective with a background of relevance. You already have to sort of be there. You already have to have experience. You already have to be present in order to even begin the question of what to compute. So you have to have some kind of common sense embodied know-how for any of these computations to make sense, or else you don't know what to pay attention to and what to ignore. So this is a question of relevance. Computation can't give you relevance. So the computational model of cognition presupposes the life world. You already have to throw yourself into this rich, meaningful, embodied life world in order for any of this to make sense. And this speaks exactly to the failures of general AI, general artificial intelligence that was so eloquently talked about before. And these similar issues also show up if we want to talk about consciousness, not just cognition. So let's just dwell a little bit more. The earlier talk about was so good about artificial intelligence and all of its problems. So I don't really need to go much into this. Just to point out that machine learning, right, which is, as we talked about, is this very, very specific kind of task that we set to these. That when a machine learning does facial recognition, it's not recognizing faces. Right? It's just, it's just a computation in some, hyperdimensional statistical space that it's pulling out statistical regularities. It doesn't know anything about faces. And that's one of the reasons why these systems are so brittle. What was hoped for in the great Dartmouth conference of 1956, I think it was, when the term artificial intelligence was coined, what they were hoping was a general intelligence like we have, where we're flexible, new situations we know how to deal with. We're not even close to that. And not only we're not even close to that, we have the wrong, because of the blind spot, we have the wrong view of what that would even mean. And I do want to point out, again, this idea of this is a place where the blind spot has a real cost for society to pay. And it was at Dartmouth that I saw a talk by a CEO of an emotional computing company. It was called Affectiva. I don't think it exists anymore. But it scared the pants off me, because the CEO was talking about how great this is going to be. It's going to be the computer, your camera's going to be able to recognize your facial position. That's going to correlate with emotions. And then, we're going to be able to sell ads with that. Or your grandma is going to have an emotional robot who can talk to her. And, of course, this completely sidesteps the question of why are old people alone? What kind of society did we build where we warehouse old people, right? I mean, so the danger here is that a blind spot application of this technology, which is unconscious, it's a crappy version of artificial intelligence, but because we can't build the real thing, we end up limiting our own lives. We end up limiting our consciousness because that's what works better for these technologies. It's as if, in order to build a driverless car, the perfect road system for a driverless car would be something that was all straight lines and right angles. So let's plow every city and build only cities that have right angles and straight lines, right? You end up making the world less human, less rich, less alive, because you've got these technologies that don't live up to what you wanted them to do. And again, but the blind spot's like, it's okay. There's nothing to experience anyway. All right. So now I want to talk a little bit about the philosophies that have responded to the blind spot, because they've been around, the recognition and response to the blind spot. And these philosophies have been around for a while. And the first one we want to talk about is phenomenology, particularly Edmund Husserl. So this is, the turn of the 20th century. And Husserl was a mathematician and a philosopher. And, he was very sensitive to the way abstractions get deployed in the science. That's a good word, how they are deployed, like how they are brought out and used. And he came up with the idea of the surreptitious substitution, that the universe of mathematical physics, the stuff from classical physics, gets promoted to the status of an objective reality, while the perceptual world that we actually live in gets demoted to the status of mere subjective appearance or even an illusion. And what he said was what you're going to do then is you're going to take for true being what is actually a method, right? It was the substitution of these abstractions and the hermetically sealed metaphysics around these abstractions, including reductionism. And you're going to say, well, that's really what's real. And your experience, that's just, the beautiful red of that sunset that you responded to, that's just an illusion. And he wrote a book in 1936, as the Nazis are rising, talking about the crisis of European sciences, where actually he pointed to the social cost of this. And of course, he was very right in many ways about that. And the crisis he was talking about is very much the crisis we're dealing with now, with the what's happening with our democratic institutions being overwhelmed by the inability to discern what's true and what's false. Now, the second philosopher we want to talk about is Alfred North Whitehead, also a mathematician and a philosopher, but in this case, he was one of the greatest mathematicians of the 20th century. So this was a human being who knew a lot about abstractions. And what Whitehead was arguing against was what he called the bifurcation of nature. And it was the conceptual split between physical nature and direct experience, right? And he said the bifurcation happens whenever we divide nature into two systems of reality, the mental and interior and the external. And he was absolutely against this. And so, for him, this was where the mind-body split that people have been doing mental yoga to overcome, for the last 400 years originated from. And it was a fundamental mistake. And as he would say, the red of a sunset is as much part of nature, fundamentally part of nature, as the molecules and light waves by which scientists use to explain it. So the idea here is, look, molecules and light waves are not more real than the red. You can't reduce the red, the experienced red, to just the an epiphenomena of the molecules and the wavelengths. And he called this emphasis on the objects of science the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. It was an accidental error, as we're going to see what we mean by accidental, of mistaking the abstract for the concrete. The concrete is where you always start. The abstract has powerful things about it that touch on reality. They may have a kind of reality in them, but the concrete is where you start. It's where you start, and it's in some sense where you have to end. So also along this, there have been people who have sort of really examined this idea of the objective frame. I call this the ontological mania. We physicists love our ontology. We love our furniture, God's furniture. And so this objective frame that we've talked about, as Thomas Nagel pointed out, was a view from nowhere. It is, what we're doing is we're kind of imagining this non-existent possibility when we imagine like, oh yes, I'm looking at the world from the God's eye view. I'm looking at the world from the objective frame, because it is a time without duration and it is a space without location. And that means that the objective frame is fundamentally unexperienced and unexperienceable. And we can understand sort of now how these philosophical views can get put together to understand how science works by the parable of temperature, which, what we can do is we can, what happens with science is that, and the world it's created, is that we daily translate temperature reports in degrees Fahrenheit or degrees Celsius into expectations of how warm or how cold we're going to feel. So, if they tell us that it's going to be 0 degrees centigrade, we're like, oh, it's going to be cold, I better put on a coat. So in some sense, we come to think that degrees centigrade temperature is more real than our experiences. Like, there's degrees centigrade floating out there in the objective world. And that's really what, temperature is about, what hot and cold are about. But with this actually flips what really happens. To distill temperature from bodily sensations of hot and cold, there was a huge and very difficult scientific effort that lasted centuries. And it was a step-by-step process of isolating those parts of hot and cold that we could, sort of agree upon by developing instruments like thermometers. So the process here was we first had to develop thermometry, how do we make something that is going to respond to temperature uniformly so we can define where in that uniform scale freezing and boiling points occur. And then we recognize like, oops, if I do this on top of a mountain and I do this at the bottom of at sea level, I actually get different values for where the boiling point and freezing point is. And then from there, we're able to take another step upward and think about formulating an abstract theory of thermodynamics. And each one of these things is a higher and higher level of abstraction, whereby we are identifying what Michel Bitbol calls the structural invariance of this lived experience. We have to pull them out. We have to take the flux of experience and sort of identify together. It's a joint effort. Which parts are invariant, and then we can build these abstractions out of it, and the abstractions get higher and higher. And we build in what Robert Crease calls the workshop. We have places where we isolate this stuff and we build equipment and machinery around it. That machinery then gets deployed into the world, which then, we build culture out of. And so it's this way that we sort of lose track of the fact that it's this direct experience of hot and cold that is really real, that is truly real, and temperature is just an abstraction. So what this speaks to is the fact that, even Stephen Hawking, who is a pretty blind spot kind of guy, recognized that, when you had all these beautiful equations that, are at the heart of the sort of blind spot view of the objective reality, you still have to ask what breathes fire into the equations. And the answer actually was right in front of all of our noses. It's direct experience. It's direct experience, which is irreducible. It's direct experience, which cannot be broken up, so it's not atoms, it's experience, which is really foundational. And that's messy. That's more messy than the hermetically sealed view of a pure reductionist, physicalist view of the world. But it's actually the right story. It's actually much more the right story than the blind spot story. So I just want to spend the last 5 minutes or so going beyond the blind spot, looking at where we might go from to escape the blind spot and all of the weight it has put on the society we built. And to do that, I'm going to point to Earth system science and the way that we look at the Earth that has developed over the last 100 years. And that really is, we point to Vladimir Vernadsky, who first came up with the idea of the biosphere. He was a geophysicist, geochemist, who recognized that, you couldn't talk about the Earth and its history, at least the outer layers, without thinking about life. That life and the rest of the planet were closely tied to each other. And that's where the idea of that Lovelock and Margellus would then build their idea of Gaia. And, of course, Gaia was this idea that the planet has to be seen in some sense as, a larger, not an organism. They would never have called it an organism, but they would have called it a system, a self-regulating system. Now, of course, Gaia was a very contentious, and it's not even clear that the idea that, the Earth can regulate itself to keep life going is true, but the ideas of this complexity, this interconnectedness became absolutely essential. What Gaia, some people dropped the name Gaia because it was contentious. And the ideas became coupled Earth system studies. And the idea here is that we got the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the cryosphere, which is all the ice, the lithosphere, which is the upper layers of the planet, and then the biosphere. And these are just so tightly connected, you can't think of them as being separate. You can't isolate just one. And they have been co-evolving for 4 billion years. And the importance of this was that, first of all, without it, we never would have recognized the trouble we're in with the Anthropocene, right? So the recognition of the Anthropocene, that human activity is now the fundamental driver of these coupled Earth systems, only came about because we really sort of knew what to look for. I mean, now it's becoming obvious, with the heat waves that were so beautifully described, and the water issues that were so beautifully described before. But we wouldn't have recognized it if we didn't have this science, this way of looking at the Earth. And it's important also to note that this Anthropocene era with climate change, that's marked by climate change and resource depletion, that it's really the cause is the success of a society that relies on science and its worldview, and the inability to recognize and do anything about climate change, even though we've known about it. Going back as far, the first presidential address to mention climate change was 1964. So the reason why we haven't done anything is because, I would argue, it's because we're dominated by kind of a blind spot way of looking at the world. All right, so there's two important things to note that kind of are kinds of new sciences that are emerging that are going to have a different metaphysics with them that may help us in developing a different kind of way of looking at science and society. And one is network theory, which always looks at what's not important or fundamental entities, it's the relationship between fundamental entities. So for like the Earth systems, there's the geosphere, the biosphere, and then what we might call the technosphere. And they are all, each one is a network of players. And it's the topology of the whole that matters. And each one of those networks is connected to other networks. So it's kind of layered networks. So I won't go into this anymore. And then another important idea that is emerging out of the science of the last 100 years, and Earth science embodies, is what's called complex systems theory, which is the recognition that you may have low-level actors, but it's the interaction between those low-level actors, molecules and atoms making proteins, proteins making proteins making the activity of a cell, a cellular metabolism, cells making organs, organs making an organism, organisms making communities and ecosystems, that we're finally able to start dealing with complexity and the nature of complexity. And one of the things, and that complexity theory really breaks the kind of reductionist view of the world, because there can be both upward and downward causation in a complex system, meaning that once the system emerges, it can make the lower levels behave in ways that you wouldn't have imagined those lower levels to behave in if you didn't have the full view. So taken together, what we see emerging out of emerging is a new paradigm for science's encounter with the world and with culture. And using Earth system science as an example with network theory and complex systems, is that this new worldview will focus on interdisciplinarity rather than domain policing, right? Because the old view was like, this is physics, that's biology. No, you can't come over here and play with us. Embodiment over abstract ontologies, the recognition that, there are certain things you have to be there to see, or else you never would have recognized they could exist. You have to be embodied in the world of nature. We are not separate from the world. We are not some kind of special privileged organism. We are deeply embedded with it. And that embodiment is really the only way to understand things. Its focus is also on holisms and relations over fundamental entities and properties. And it also recognizes emergence and reduction. And I'm not doing emergence versus reductionism here, because, what you recognize from this is that, sometimes it makes sense to reduce things to their smaller parts. But that's just a method. Sometimes that totally doesn't work. And sometimes you want to focus on the rules and properties of those higher layers. So we're not privileging reductionism and saying like, yeah, really, the only truth that exists are the truths from those fundamental layers. We're recognizing that sometimes you focus on those and sometimes you focus on the higher layers, and they each have their kind of equal claim to truth. And I'll sort of, in my last couple minutes here, I want to focus or end with a conjecture on political economy. I am not an economist or a political scientist, but I've been trying to, my suspicion And this comes, I've been doing some deep dives into the literature on science and capitalism, for example, a history. These are histories that the economic, industrial, and production systems that were created in the wake of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment really carry the imprint of the blind spot worldview. So both capitalism and socialism, with how they view life, the living world, how they view the relationship between resources and the living world, were pretty much the same. There's really not a fundamental difference between them. And you see this certainly in socialism, because materialism was like essential to how Marx was thinking. And so the idea here is, look, if you want something different, you really are going to have to imagine a very different kind of political economy. So, as I like to say, a post-blind spot political economy, in that if your theory of economics doesn't have the word planetary in it, you kind of missed the point, okay? Because that's the recognition that there is this, this global coupled systems, and you can't just separate one piece out like the economy and think that it's not going to spill over into the biosphere, the atmosphere, etc. So is there a way forward? Yes. Am I hopeful? Yes, because what's the alternative? But I really am hopeful. I think we are poised to take the next step beyond the Enlightenment. It's time for our own version of an enlightenment. And we're not even going to use that word anymore. It's time to go beyond it, because, it's going to mean something more than what the creators of the Enlightenment meant. And what it's going to do, well, part of it will be to embrace the incredible power of science as a dialogue between us and nature, not us controlling nature or vexing nature or, using nature for our own ends, but a dialogue with nature and the world. Because what we recognize is that science is a self-correcting narrative that is grounded in the irreducibility of experience. It is not a view to a perfect objective reality that, we and God can share looking at. And also this means, embracing all the different cultures that are and histories that make up humanity, embracing the full range of human cultural histories and perspectives, because there's a lot of wisdom out there, right? This is about knowledge more than wisdom, wisdom more than knowledge, that, the blind spot view of truth just is blind to. So, I will end there with this quote by the great poet Muriel Rukeyser. And I've been saying this quote, or repeating this quote my whole life. The universe is made of stories, not atoms. And the importance of this is who's the storyteller? We are. Okay. So I'll end there, and I thank you very much for your time and patience.
Hey, fabulous. Thanks, Adam, very much. That was a tour de force, indeed, which means we have pretty much zero time for questions. We have 1 minute. So since at the very end, you talked about different cultures, there is one question that fits very much with that. So let's go with that one. And I know you love to talk about it. So given the Western origins of the blind spot, are there non-Western locales where science is conducted differently with smaller or different blind spots, like different ways of thinking?
Well, I think, every version of human, it's hard to find a human culture that was associated with the, what came after the agrarian revolution. There's been a lot of empires, which have all been pretty resource extractive. It's really only been smaller, the smaller cultures that could kind of hide from the empires that had, I think, better relationships with the environment. But, human beings have also been pretty bad to the environment overall. Like, where are the mastodons? So I think there are definitely examples of cultures that recognized their dependence on biology, on the living world, much better than we do. But science right now, the science globally is still very much in the thrall of the blind spot. And the trick for all of us across the world, now that science is a global activity practiced by cultures across the globe, is for us to see what can we build now by bringing all those cultures together and being intentional about what we think about the metaphysics. Because the blind spot, there was nothing evil behind it. It's just, it grew, it grew with science. And it's only now that we can recognize, wait a minute, that doesn't speak for science. There's other ways to think about it.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. And I think that our next speaker is going to give us a great education on what kind of hotspot we're in right now. So Adam, thank you so much, and stay tuned. And okay, I have to go on and invite my next speaker.